So I first became interested in this topic in the aftermath of 9/11, and I started working on it in 2006 when the US and the UK were deeply involved in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was in the aftermath of the London bombings, and I became interested in these wars and the social history of these wars. And in particular, very interested in the way that Islam had come into public profile in the West. And narratives that were circulating about Islam as dangerous, long-standing Orientalist tropes that were being reinvented. And I was interested in the ways in which Western secular experience was conditioning not only these tropes, but also the policy and strategy in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and in the struggle against Islamic radicalism within the West in terms of counterterrorism. And I wanted to understand what is the relationship between that social secular experience and those things. And Britain is my case study for that. And the UK is interesting because of several reasons. First, it's between 40 and 65% secular, meaning that people either are indifferent to religion or are agnostic or express disinterest or are atheists. And that places the UK in the category of one of the most non-religious in the world. In comparison, for example, in the US, where the figures are something more like 15%. Britain also has a very interesting colonial history and with a large Muslim population domestically as well. So my methodology is a qualitative one, and it's based on over 50 interviews that I did between 2007 and 2011, interviewing policymakers, senior policymakers, senior figures in the British military, religious leaders, members of civil society, journalists, people who were involved in or aware of the ways in which British policy thinking was shaped collectively and could comment on British policy towards Muslims at home and abroad. And then I also looked at media sources, policy documents, literature, art, social expressions of understandings of religion and secularity in Britain. The book also delves into the historical period. This contemporary phenomenon, while it is rooted in the post-9/11 period, comes out of a history. And I looked at that specific history, delving into archives, both in Britain and also in Northern Ireland, because I think the Northern Irish experience tells us quite a lot about what happens in terms of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency after 9/11. So what I identified through my interviews and reviews of the various other materials was what I call a secular habitus in British society. Now this is a concept that the sociologist Bourdieu uses to talk about common social experience and practices that is largely unconscious and produces a wide range of results. It's not prescriptive in any way. And I identified that there were three specific periods or three specific differences since the period 2001. So between 2001 and 2005, the British government and policymakers on the civilian and military side had less experience with Islam than they would later acquire. To some extent, this made a difference. Of course, British policy was conditioned by a wide range of other factors. Relations between Britain and Afghanistan, Britain and Iraq, Britain and other countries in the Middle East are conditioned by power politics and economics and security and various other things. But culture did make a difference. So in this period, the case study that I used was looking at Iraq, in particular looking at the British experience in Basra. And I looked at the case study of the Jaish al-Mahdi, Muqtada al-Sadr's militia in southern Iraq. And the ways in which British and also American misreadings of the militia were in part conditioned by a discomfort with what they saw culturally. Now, this is significant because Muqtada al-Sadr was one of the most important instigators in the sectarian civil war that broke out in 2006. But one of the things I also found was that British attitudes towards religion were also informed by cultural Christianity as well as political liberalism, which led them to appreciate the importance, for example, of religious leaders and of Islamist political parties in southern Iraq, to respect them and to integrate them into the burgeoning democracy that the British were trying to foster during the Coalition Provisional Authority period. There was a difference, I think, after the London bombings. The London bombings emphasized to the British government that they needed to increase their analytical capacity. They needed to get better at understanding the dynamics of religion and politics, both in Britain and abroad. They improved their levels of analysis. However, this was also within the context of various security measures targeting the Muslim community as a whole in Britain. Now, these things are well documented, and I go into some specific particularities about radicalization and religious education, where I think the British government intervened in relation to the role of Islam in politics, but also explore the ways in which Muslim organizations and Christian organizations and other religious groups interfaced with this new reality. And again, as I said, some of these outcomes were positive, a greater attention to religion in public life in Britain and abroad. And my main finding, I suppose, was an exploration that war is generative, and war, which scholars have explored, and we know that war changes societies. And I found that the 9/11 wars and the experience of diplomats and soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan with religion there also was reflected in changes among British society. British society and policymakers became more aware of British governmental practices as secular, of political assumptions as secular, and of society as more secular in its outlook and its perceptions of what is politically possible. There were several main findings that came out of my research. The first was that the British government significantly improved the ways in which it dealt with Islam, with the Muslim community in Britain, with Muslim life in the Middle East and Central Asia in the period 2001 to 2011. That said, I also identified a series of mistakes or misperceptions that could be improved in the future. The main story we hear about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is that difficulties were primarily due to lack of resources or political mistakes. My takeaway point from that would also be to say that attention to the culture and the society that is fighting the war, our own culture and society, is as important as money and funding and boots on the ground. Another takeaway point from this was to point out that while I know that these are the ways in which these things played out in the British case, that I don't think this is a purely British phenomenon. More research is needed to identify the ways in which this played out across the West, in American policy, in French, German, other European states' policy and practices during this historical period. And finally, my third conclusion is that the secular matters in international affairs. People's non-religious attitudes, whether they be humanist, agnostic, atheist, in some way loosely spiritual or indifferent, this actually changes the world. And this is one case in which I found it, but I think we need to spend more time exploring this, both in the academy and the policy world.